Welcome. We're starting a new series on the generational planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto in the signs. And this series is going to be a little different from the ones we did on the personal planets. With the personal planets, it made sense to slow down and give each sign its own space because those placements describe parts of your day-to-day personality. They're immediate. They're personal. You tend to recognize them quickly in yourself. But the generational planets work differently. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto move much more slowly, which means entire groups of people can share the same sign placement. So these planets are not just describing personal traits in the same direct way. They speak to deeper patterns, collective patterns, generational themes, the atmosphere of an era. The psychological and spiritual material a whole age group is here to work through, challenge, transform, or wake up to. That's why, in this series, we're keeping all the signs together in the same video for each planet. Instead of splitting them up the way we did before, we're going to look at the full journey of each generational planet through the zodiac, so you can really see how the energy changes from sign to sign, and how each generation carries a different lesson, pressure, obsession, gift, or calling. Because that's really what these planets describe. Uranus shows where a generation is here to break patterns, disrupt old systems, and push consciousness forward. It speaks to rebellion, innovation, awakening, and the need for freedom. Neptune shows the dreams, ideals, longings, illusions, and spiritual myths of a generation. It shows what people are tempted to believe in, what they want to transcend, and where inspiration and confusion can get tangled together. And Pluto shows the deepest level of transformation. It reveals where a generation encounters power, shadow, destruction, renewal, and the need to evolve through forces bigger than the individual ego. These are not light placements. They don't usually describe the surface of a person. They describe deeper tides moving underneath the surface, both in individual lives and in the collective. And even though these planets are generational, that does not mean they are vague or unimportant in the natal chart. Far from it. They still matter deeply, especially when they make strong aspects to your personal planets or angles. They can describe the deeper forces shaping your worldview, your instincts, your fears, your ideals, and the kind of transformation you're part of in this lifetime. So in this series, we're going to explore Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto in every sign, not just as astrology placements, but as living generational signatures. We're going to talk about what each sign placement was trying to awaken, dissolve, expose, intensify, or transform. We're going to look at the gifts, the distortions, the collective moods, and the deeper meaning behind each one. So this series is a little bigger in scope. It's more collective, more psychological, more symbolic, and in many ways more revealing. Because once you understand the generational planets, you start to understand not just yourself, but the deeper story of the time you were born into. And if you enjoy this kind of astrology content, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you'd like a more personal look at your own chart, you can book a consultation. Uranus in Aries. Uranus in Aries is the spark that does not ask for permission. This is the generation that feels change as something urgent, personal, and immediate. Not someday. Not when the timing is better. Now. Right now. There's something about this placement that wants to move first, figure it out later, and deal with the consequences on the way down. Uranus is the planet of disruption, awakening, rebellion, invention, and sudden shifts. Aries is the sign of instinct, courage, action, heat, and raw forward motion. So when you put them together, you get a placement that does not come here to preserve the old script. It comes here to break inertia. This is rebel energy, but not always in a polished or strategic form. It is more like this. Something feels false, something feels dead, something feels slow, and the system needs a shock to the heart. Uranus in Aries tends to produce a generation that pushes for freedom in direct, unapologetic ways. These people do not want to wait for institutions to catch up. They would rather start the thing themselves, say the uncomfortable truth themselves, build the new path themselves, and take the risk themselves. There is a strong do-it-yourself current here. A refusal to sit around asking whether they are allowed. A refusal to keep shrinking to fit old models. A refusal to treat independence like a distant reward. At its best, this placement is brave. It brings innovators who are willing to act before certainty arrives. It brings people who can wake others up simply by moving with honesty and nerve. It pushes against passivity. It challenges learned helplessness. It says that change is not only an idea. Change is something you do. And because Aries is so tied to identity, Uranus in Aries often shakes up the whole question of selfhood. Who am I if I stop performing? Who am I if I stop obeying? Who am I if I trust my own instincts more than the rules I inherited? That is part of the deeper awakening here. This generation often has to learn that freedom is not just rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It is the courage to live from a more real center. Not the most liked version. Not the most manageable version. The real version. But every Uranus placement has its chaos. With Uranus in Aries, the shadow can look like impulsiveness dressed up as liberation. It can look like starting fires everywhere and calling that evolution. It can look like impatience, defensiveness, unnecessary conflict, and the belief that being challenged is the same thing as being controlled. This placement can be allergic to slowing down. It may rush into change without asking whether the change is actually wise. It may fight first and reflect later. It may become so attached to personal freedom that it forgets other people exist. And that is where the growth comes in. Because Uranus in Aries is not here to become reckless. It is here to become fearless and awake. There is a difference. The lesson is not just how to break away. It is how to break away without losing direction. How to act without being ruled by pure impulse. How to trust instinct without turning every moment into a battlefield. When this placement is lived well, it is electrifying. It brings pioneers, starters, people who can cut through fear and hesitation with sheer life force. It brings the kind of energy that says, yes, the old way is cracking and good. Maybe it needed to. There is something refreshing about Uranus in Aries because it does not pretend transformation has to be graceful to be real. Sometimes awakening is messy. Sometimes growth is loud. Sometimes the breakthrough arrives like a door kicked open. And this placement understands that. Uranus in Aries does not come here to whisper change from the sidelines. It comes in hot. It wakes people up by example. It pushes life forward through action. And at its highest expression, it reminds us that freedom begins the moment a person stops waiting to become themselves. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more astrology content. Uranus in Taurus. Uranus in Taurus does not announce itself like a lightning strike in an open sky. It is more unsettling than that. It changes the ground under people's feet. This is the generation that learns very quickly that security is not always secure, and that what looks permanent can be far more fragile than anyone wants to admit. Taurus is supposed to be the sign of steadiness, of what lasts, of what can be trusted because it has weight, shape, and substance. Uranus has no interest in leaving those things untouched when they have become stagnant, outdated, or hollow. So this placement brings disruption into the most concrete parts of life: money, work, survival, the body, nature, ownership, labor, comfort, habit, not in a vague, symbolic way, in a very real one. People with this signature are born into a chapter of history where old definitions of value begin to wobble. What counts as success starts changing. What people are willing to tolerate in order to feel safe starts changing too. Entire systems that once looked solid can suddenly seem artificial, wasteful, or completely unsustainable. And Taurus feels that deeply because Taurus is not theoretical. It wants what is real. What can feed you? What can support you? What can hold up over time? That is why Uranus in Taurus can produce such an interesting kind of person. They are not always the loudest rebels in the room. Often they are slower to move, slower to trust, slower to let go. But once they realize something is no longer viable, they can become impossible to turn back. The shift is not superficial. It reaches all the way down to the foundation. There is often a powerful instinct here to simplify life, but not in a trendy way. More in the sense of stripping things back to what actually matters. What is useful? What is nourishing? What is worth the energy it costs? This generation can have a strong radar for excess, false promises, inflated values, and lifestyles that look impressive but drain the soul. That is part of the awakening. It is not only about changing the world out there. It is also about changing the relationship to worth on the inside. Taurus is tied to self-esteem, and Uranus moving through this sign can shake that territory hard. A person may discover that they built their confidence on appearances, possessions, routines, or external proof, only to find that none of it is enough once life starts shifting. Then the real work begins. What remains when the old markers stop working? What still feels true when the script falls apart? What kind of life is actually mine, not just inherited, copied, purchased, or performed? Uranus in Taurus has a gift for forcing those questions into the open. It can produce brilliant reformers in practical fields. People who rethink finance, food, architecture, agriculture, beauty, design, business, sustainability, and the way human beings relate to the material world. There is often ingenuity here, but it tends to be grounded ingenuity. Not invention for spectacle. Invention that solves a problem. Invention that makes life more livable. Invention that remembers human beings have bodies, limits, needs, and nervous systems. There is also a sensual intelligence in this placement that should not be overlooked. Taurus knows when something feels off long before it can explain why. Uranus electrifies that instinct. So this generation can be unusually responsive to changes in atmosphere, in economics, in collective stress, in the health of the environment, and in the hidden cost of convenience. Of course, the shadow is real. Sometimes Uranus in Taurus hangs on too long. It can cling to routines that have already expired, simply because uncertainty feels worse than dissatisfaction. It can become possessive, rigid, or overly controlled when life starts asking for change. On the other side, it can suddenly blow up an entire structure after years of silent frustration, leaving everyone wondering why the break was so absolute. That is the tension here. Knowing the difference between loyalty and stagnation, between patience and fear, between building carefully and refusing to evolve. When this energy matures, it becomes incredibly steady in a new way. Not steady because nothing changes, but steady because it has learned how to adapt without abandoning itself. That is real strength. Not denial, not numbness, not clinging. A deeper kind of stability, one that can survive movement because it is rooted in truth rather than habit. Uranus in Taurus is here to challenge counterfeit security. It asks whether comfort has become a cage, whether success has become disconnected from life, whether the things people worship actually deserve their loyalty. And when lived well, this placement helps create something far more valuable than the old system ever offered. A life built on substance, integrity, and a sharper understanding of what is truly worth holding on to. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more astrology content. Uranus in Gemini. Uranus in Gemini is the mind on overdrive. This is the placement that speeds everything up. Thought moves faster. Communication changes faster. Information multiplies faster. The old way of learning, speaking, connecting, trading ideas, even paying attention, stops feeling sufficient. Something in the air gets restless, electric, impossible to slow down. Uranus is the planet of disruption, invention, rebellion, and awakening. Gemini rules language, curiosity, media, conversation, local networks, learning, and the way people process the world one thought at a time. So when Uranus moves through Gemini, change does not arrive quietly. It travels through words, signals, headlines, rumors, technology, ideas, and mental habits. This is a generation born into motion. Not just physical motion, but mental motion. A quickness, a constant switching of channels, a hunger to know, to ask, to compare, to challenge, to connect one thing to another before the rest of the room has caught up. These are the people who often sense that the story is changing before anyone has fully admitted it. And that can be a gift. Uranus in Gemini can produce sharp, inventive, adaptable minds. People who learn quickly, improvise well, and know how to move between worlds, languages, perspectives, and systems of thought. There is often real brilliance here when it comes to pattern recognition. They can spot cracks in an argument, flaws in a narrative, or possibilities other people miss because they are not attached to one fixed viewpoint. This placement does not love intellectual cages. It gets suspicious of rigid thinking, stale messaging, and any environment where curiosity is treated like a threat. It wants movement in the mind, fresh input, open windows, better questions. It often pushes a generation to rethink how people communicate and how truth itself is delivered, packaged, and consumed. That is where things get interesting. Because Gemini is not only about intelligence, it is also about noise. And Uranus does not always bring clarity first. Sometimes it brings overstimulation, too much data, too many voices, too many opinions arriving at once. The shadow side of Uranus in Gemini can look like mental scattering, nervous exhaustion, shallow reactions, contrarianism for sport, or living in a permanent state of interruption. A person with this energy can become so fascinated by what is new that they stop staying with anything long enough to go deep. They may know a little about everything and still feel strangely unanchored. There can also be a temptation to confuse speed with insight, as if the fastest answer must be the smartest one. But that is not the deeper lesson here. The deeper lesson is discernment. How do you stay open without becoming fragmented? How do you remain curious without getting lost in trivia, distraction, or endless commentary? How do you use the mind as a tool for awakening rather than letting it become a machine that never stops spinning? That is the real work of Uranus in Gemini. This placement often belongs to generations that live through major shifts in media, education, transportation, technology, publishing, and the collective nervous system itself. The pace of life changes. The way people gather facts changes. The social meaning of information changes. Suddenly the world feels smaller, faster, louder, and more connected than before. And not everyone handles that well. Some people wake up under this influence. Others get overwhelmed by it. That is why Uranus in Gemini can be so brilliant when it matures. At its best, it creates minds that are lively without being chaotic, original without being performative, and flexible without becoming hollow. These are the people who can translate complexity for others. They can bring new ideas into circulation. They can challenge stale assumptions without sounding like they are simply trying to shock the room. There is also a playful side to this placement that matters. Gemini has wit, timing, verbal agility. Uranus adds surprise. So this generation can be very good at using humor, language, and unexpected perspective to shake people out of stale thinking. Sometimes the breakthrough comes through a theory, sometimes through a sentence, sometimes through one perfectly timed observation that suddenly makes the old worldview sound ridiculous. Uranus in Gemini does not want people sleepwalking through borrowed opinions. It wants live minds, alert minds, minds that can question, adapt, and keep learning. And at its highest expression, this placement reminds us that intelligence is not just about having more information. It is about staying awake enough to recognize which ideas open the future and which ones are only more noise. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more astrology content. Uranus in Cancer. Uranus in Cancer changes the meaning of home. Not in a small way either. This placement stirs the private world. Family patterns, emotional habits, childhood conditioning, the unspoken rules people inherit before they are old enough to question any of it. Cancer wants safety, familiarity, and a place to land. Uranus shows up and asks whether that place was ever truly safe to begin with. That is where the tension lives. Cancer is tied to roots, belonging, memory, caretaking, and the need for emotional shelter. Uranus brings disruption, awakening, reversal, and the refusal to keep living inside something that no longer works. Put them together and you get a generation that often has to confront the fact that closeness can become entrapment, Tradition can become emotional pressure, and loyalty can keep people tied to patterns that should have ended long ago. So this placement often marks people who do family differently. Sometimes they are born into unstable homes and learn early that security can disappear overnight. Sometimes they grow up surrounded by old expectations around caregiving, motherhood, protection, or sacrifice, then spend years trying to understand which parts are real and which parts are inherited fear wearing the mask of love. Sometimes they become the one who names what everyone else avoided. That matters more than it sounds, because Cancer does not just describe tenderness. It also describes what people do to feel protected, even when those strategies are outdated, overly defensive, or quietly damaging. Uranus in Cancer can expose just how much emotional life gets built around repetition. The same family roles, the same guilt, the same silence, the same instinct to protect the group at the expense of the individual. This generation is often here to interrupt that cycle, not because they do not care, but because they care enough to stop pretending. They may redefine what home looks like. They may question family myths. They may refuse the idea that nurturing always means self-erasure. They may walk away from emotional arrangements that once seemed non-negotiable. And underneath all of that is a deeper lesson about belonging. What does home feel like when it is chosen instead of inherited? What happens when a person stops confusing attachment with love? What remains when the old emotional script no longer fits? Those are Uranus in Cancer questions. There is usually a strong sensitivity here, but it does not always show up in soft or obvious ways. Sometimes it comes through a hyper-alert nervous system, sometimes through sudden withdrawal, sometimes through the need for more space than other people expect from someone with so much feeling. This is not a placement that stays comfortable with emotional dependency for long. Even when it wants closeness, it also needs room to breathe. That can make relationships with family complicated. Love may be present, but so is friction. Care may be genuine, but so is unpredictability. The past may feel important, but not sacred. At its best, Uranus in Cancer brings emotional intelligence that is both intuitive and honest. These are often the people who can sense what is off in a room before anyone says a word. They understand atmosphere. They pick up on buried tension. They know when someone is acting out an old wound instead of speaking from the present. And because of that, they can become powerful agents of change in the most personal corners of life. This placement can reshape the way a generation thinks about parenting, housing, ancestry, domestic roles, and emotional labor. It can bring new ideas around care, but also a much sharper awareness of how easily care becomes control when fear is running the show. The shadow, of course, is real. A person with this influence may swing between craving closeness and resisting it. They may protect themselves so quickly that nobody gets near the real heart underneath. Old emotional shocks can sit close to the surface, making ordinary vulnerability feel riskier than it really is. In some cases, family wounds stay so active that the person keeps rebuilding the same dynamic in different forms, hoping the ending will finally change. That is why the growth here is so important. Uranus in Cancer is not asking people to become detached. It is asking them to become conscious, to notice what was learned in survival mode, to separate real care from emotional reflex, to make room for a more honest kind of closeness, one that does not depend on guilt, secrecy, or permanent regression. When this energy matures, something beautiful happens. Home stops being a script. Family stops being a prison sentence. The past stops running the whole show. Then the placement becomes what it was always trying to be. A new way of caring, a new way of protecting, a new way of belonging without disappearing inside what came before. That is Uranus in Cancer. A generation that cannot settle for emotional patterns just because they are old. A generation that questions what nurtures and what merely contains. A generation that understands healing sometimes begins the moment someone decides the old atmosphere is no longer acceptable. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more astrology content. Uranus in Leo. Uranus in Leo does not slip quietly into the room. It wants to be felt. There is something bold about this sign combination from the start. Uranus brings rupture, invention, surprise, and the urge to break from what has gone stale. Leo brings theater, confidence, creativity, pride, romance, and the need to express something unmistakably personal. Put them together and you get a force that does not want life to be flat, colorless, or obedient. This is where the hunger to stand out gets electrified. People born under this influence often carry a strong instinct to make their mark, but not in a mild or modest way. They want expression that feels alive. They want a life with pulse in it. They are rarely interested in shrinking themselves to keep everyone else comfortable, and when they do try, it usually does not last. Something in them eventually rebels against being reduced, overlooked, or asked to play small for too long. That can be exciting to watch. It can also be a lot. Leo is tied to the heart, to joy, to play, to performance, to the part of a person that wants to create, love, lead, and be recognized for what makes them special. Uranus moving through this territory shakes all of that up. It asks hard questions about identity and visibility. What happens when the old image no longer fits? What happens when attention becomes addictive? What happens when self-expression is real? And when is it just another costume? That is where this sign gets interesting, because Uranus in Leo is not only about sparkle. It is also about reinvention through the crisis of selfhood. Very often, this energy shows up in people who cannot fully live by inherited ideas of success, talent, leadership, masculinity, femininity, fame, or creative worth. They may be drawn to the spotlight, yet suspicious of what the spotlight does to people. They may want admiration, yet resent the pressure that comes with being seen. They may hunger for love, applause, or approval, then realize none of it satisfies if the version being celebrated is not the real one. So beneath all the style and flair, there is often a deeper struggle here. How to live from the heart without turning life into a performance for constant validation. That is the work. Because Leo can be wonderfully generous, warm, and radiant, but it can also become overly identified with image. Uranus does not let that stay stable forever. It disrupts the polished persona. It exposes where pride has hardened into ego. It pushes a person to discover whether their confidence is rooted in something genuine, or whether it collapses the second the room stops clapping. That is not always comfortable. Sometimes this influence produces people who come on strong, burn bright, and make a huge impression, only to go through periods of sharp inner unrest. Not because they lack talent, but because talent alone is not enough. Not because they lack magnetism, but because magnetism is not the same thing as self-knowledge. There can be a dramatic quality here, but the drama usually points to something real. The heart wants freedom, not just attention. And when that truth lands, a lot can shift. This sign can produce remarkable originality in art, music, entertainment, leadership, fashion, romance, and anything that depends on personal style. There is courage here when it comes to taking creative risks. A willingness to try something bolder, stranger, more vivid, more unapologetically individual. These are often the people who help redefine what confidence looks like, what beauty looks like, what star power looks like, and what it means to lead with personality instead of imitation. Still, there are traps. A person can become hooked on shock value. They can mistake defiance for authenticity. They can turn every relationship into a stage and every disagreement into a scene. They can become so focused on being unforgettable that they forget to be honest. That is where Uranus in Leo can lose its center. The answer is not to become smaller. It is to become more real, more anchored in the heart, less dependent on reaction, less concerned with proving uniqueness every second of the day. The most compelling version of this sign is not the loudest one. It is the one that creates from genuine fire instead of ego panic. And that is when the best of it comes through. Then you get people with daring vision and real warmth. People who can inspire others because they are not copying anybody. People who understand that creativity is not only decoration, it is life force. It is what happens when a human being stops asking for permission to be vivid. There is also something important here about leadership. Uranus in Leo does not respect hollow authority for very long. It pushes back against stale power, pomp, and titles that no longer mean anything. It would rather follow someone with heart than someone with status. In many cases, it creates people who lead by example, by originality, by sheer presence, not because they were handed the crown. So the deeper story of Uranus in Leo is not simply about being seen. It is about becoming brave enough to create from the core of who you are, to love without acting, to shine without turning life into a contest, to stop confusing applause with self-worth. When that happens, this sign becomes unforgettable for the right reasons. Not because it demands attention, but because it brings vitality back into spaces that had gone dull, mechanical, or lifeless. That is Uranus in Leo. A restless heart, a creative spark that refuses to be tamed, a need to live in full color, but truthfully. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more astrology content. Uranus in Virgo. Uranus in Virgo brings unrest into the parts of life most people treat as routine. The schedule, the workload, the habits, the body, the standards people live by without even realizing they are living by them. This is not a placement that usually announces itself with grand drama. It works closer to the ground. It notices the flaw in the system, the waste in the process, the strain no one has named, the little malfunction that tells you the whole arrangement needs rethinking. That is where its power lives. Uranus is the planet of disruption, awakening, breakthrough, and rebellion. Virgo is the sign of method, precision, maintenance, service, discernment, and all the invisible labor that keeps life running. Put them together, and the result is a generation that cannot leave inefficiency alone. They are wired to question how things are done, why people keep repeating what clearly is not working, and how the mess got normalized in the first place. This energy often shows up through reform, but not the glamorous kind. It is less about making a speech and more about fixing the machinery. Less about image and more about function. Less about theory and more about whether something actually holds up in real life. People shaped by this placement tend to have a sharp radar for disorder, but not only physical disorder. They notice poor systems, sloppy thinking, wasted effort, outdated procedures, false expertise, and all the ways people create unnecessary complication because nobody wants to admit the old method has expired. Virgo already has a strong instinct to improve. Uranus makes that instinct impatient. So this generation may feel deeply uncomfortable with routines that are deadening, jobs that treat human beings like replaceable parts, and standards that sound sensible on paper but quietly damage people in practice. They are often the ones asking why the process is so broken, why the body is paying the price, why everyone is calling something normal when normal looks exhausted, anxious, overworked, and completely disconnected from what is healthy. That matters with Virgo because this sign is closely tied to health and daily functioning. Uranus in Virgo can produce people who think differently about medicine, nutrition, wellness, labor, education, technology, healing, and the relationship between mind and body. Sometimes they are the ones who modernize systems that were too rigid. Sometimes they expose how much harm can hide inside efficiency when efficiency becomes more important than the human being. And sometimes the disruption gets personal. This placement can bring a restless relationship with perfectionism. A person may grow up believing they need to earn their worth through usefulness, competence, productivity, or getting everything right. Then Uranus comes in and starts breaking that identity apart. Suddenly the old standards no longer fit. The body pushes back. The nervous system gets overloaded. The tidy self-image starts cracking. And underneath all of that is a difficult but necessary realization. Being needed is not the same thing as being free. That is one of the deeper lessons here. Virgo can become tightly managed, controlled, hypervigilant. Uranus does not tolerate that forever. It introduces unpredictability into the very areas people try hardest to organize. Not to be cruel, but to make growth unavoidable. The person has to learn when discipline is useful and when it becomes an obsession. They have to learn the difference between care and control, between precision and rigidity, between devotion to improvement and chronic dissatisfaction with everything, including themselves. At its best, Uranus in Virgo produces brilliant problem solvers. These are the people who can redesign a process, refine a craft, troubleshoot a crisis, or spot the missing piece before anyone else sees it. Their intelligence is often practical, exact, and highly responsive. They may not always want the spotlight, but they know how to make things better. Not prettier, better, cleaner, smarter, more honest, more sustainable, more humane. There is often a particular talent here for bridging the old and the new. Virgo understands skill. Uranus understands innovation. So this placement can create people who respect craft but are not trapped by tradition. They know how to update a method without losing what made it valuable. They know how to question authority without becoming careless. They know how to experiment without abandoning standards entirely. Still, the shadow is real. This energy can become edgy, overcritical, overly cerebral, or trapped in permanent troubleshooting mode. It may keep scanning for what is wrong and forget to register what is working. It may become so focused on optimization that life starts to feel like an endless repair project. In some cases, the person rebels against order altogether, but because Virgo is still involved, the rebellion itself can turn fussy, anxious, and oddly controlled. That is the paradox. The mind wants freedom. The nervous system wants calm. The habits want structure. The soul wants relief from the pressure of getting everything exactly right. Learning how to hold those needs together is the real work. When Uranus in Virgo matures, it becomes an extraordinary placement for intelligent service. Not servitude. Service. There is a difference. This is where skill meets conscience, where discernment becomes wisdom, where improvement is no longer driven by insecurity, but by a genuine wish to make life function better for everyone involved. That is when the placement becomes deeply impressive. Not flashy, not theatrical, useful in the best sense of the word. Capable, awake, precise without becoming cold, inventive without becoming chaotic. It can build systems that respect real human limits. It can challenge unhealthy norms without turning every detail into a crisis. It can bring order where there was confusion, but also fresh thinking where order had become lifeless. That is Uranus in Virgo, a generation that cannot ignore the crack in the structure. A generation that questions what passes for normal. A generation that understands that sometimes the revolution begins in the daily grind, the body, the workflow, the standard everyone stopped examining years ago. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more astrology content. Uranus in Libra. Uranus in Libra changes the rules of connection. This is the placement that stops taking relationship at face value. It does not automatically trust the script, the polite performance, the social agreement, or the idea that harmony is always a sign that something is healthy. Libra usually wants balance, grace, fairness, beauty, and some kind of workable peace between people. Uranus comes along and asks a far more uncomfortable question. Peace for whom? That is where this placement starts. Because Libra is not only about romance and charm. It is also about partnership, negotiation, social values, mutuality, and the structures people build to live with one another. Marriage belongs here. Diplomacy belongs here. So do manners, expectations, and the silent bargains people make in order to be accepted. Uranus does not move through that territory gently. It exposes the cracks in relationships that look fine from the outside, but are built on compromise without truth. So this generation often carries a very different instinct around partnership. They are less willing to stay in roles that feel artificial, less willing to accept relationship models just because they are familiar or socially approved. There is often a sharp awareness here that connection should not require self-erasure, and that equality is not the same as surface-level peacekeeping. People with this placement can feel deeply drawn to union, but they also need breathing room inside it. They want closeness, but not at the cost of authenticity. That can make them complicated partners. Not because they do not care. Usually they care a great deal. But they tend to sense quickly when a relationship has become performative, dutiful, imbalanced, or overly controlled by appearances. They can become restless in arrangements where everyone is being nice, but nobody is being real. They may be the ones who question traditions around marriage, gender roles, commitment, loyalty, or what two people actually owe each other when love is involved. And that questioning matters. Libra is often associated with beauty and cooperation, but there is a harder edge underneath it. This sign is always dealing with the problem of the other person, their needs, their preferences, their contradictions, their power. Uranus brings a jolt into that whole equation. Suddenly the old dance no longer works. One person stops playing the expected role. Another wants more freedom. A quiet imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. The relationship either evolves or starts showing how fragile it really was. This influence can also show up well beyond romance. It can reshape the collective sense of justice, civility, social etiquette, and fairness itself. People born under it often live through periods when public ideas about equality begin shifting fast. Standards around who has a voice, who gets included, what counts as respectful, and what kind of relationship structures are considered normal may all start changing. Libra notices social design. Uranus redesigns it. There is often real elegance in this placement when it is working well. A person may have a gift for bringing fresh thinking into human dynamics without becoming cold or detached. They can be original without being abrasive. They know how to challenge stale expectations in ways that feel intelligent, stylish, and clear. Sometimes they're the ones who bring new ideas into law, art, fashion, social thought, or partnership itself. Still, this is not effortless energy. One of the problems with Uranus in Libra is that it can become addicted to contrast. The person may keep seeking excitement through the unexpected, the unconventional, the unavailable, or the destabilizing. They may confuse chemistry with compatibility. They may talk endlessly about fairness while quietly avoiding the emotional mess of real intimacy. In some cases, the desire to stay free becomes so strong that commitment starts to feel like a trap, even when the relationship is healthy. There can also be a tendency to detach right when things become truly personal. Libra likes perspective. Uranus likes space. Together, they can become very good at analysis and not always as good at staying present when the heart is on the line. A person may keep relationships in the realm of theory, idealism, or aesthetic preference because genuine vulnerability feels harder to manage than intellectual agreement. So the growth here is subtle but important. It is not about choosing between freedom and partnership. It is about learning how to tell the truth inside relationship without blowing it up every time discomfort appears. It is about discovering that fairness is not a performance and love is not proven through perfect behavior. A living connection needs honesty, movement, and enough openness for both people to remain fully themselves. When Uranus in Libra matures, it becomes one of the most interesting placements for reimagining how people meet each other. Not through control, not through outdated duty, not through appearances alone, but through reciprocity with air in it, through respect that does not flatten difference, through partnership that allows change instead of punishing it. That is where this sign really shines. It can bring people who know how to update the social contract. People who can sense when a relationship needs a new language, not just better manners. People who understand that beauty is not only visual. Sometimes beauty is what happens when two people stop performing harmony and begin building something far more honest. That is Uranus in Libra. A different idea of love. A different idea of equality. A different idea of what it means to be together without disappearing inside the arrangement. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more astrology content. Uranus in Scorpio. Uranus in Scorpio does not do shallow change. This is the kind of placement that rips the lid off whatever people would rather keep buried. It does not skim the surface, tidy things up, and move on. It goes straight for the hidden charge in a situation. The fear, the obsession, the power struggle, the desire nobody named, the wound everybody organized their life around without admitting it. That is the territory here. Uranus brings shocks, reversals, breakthroughs, defiance, and the need to break from what has become deadening or false. Scorpio rules intimacy, control, secrets, crisis, trust, loss, fusion, and the deep psychological material that does not disappear just because it is inconvenient. Put them together, and you get a generation that tends to encounter transformation in a raw, undeniable form. These are not people who are meant to stay comfortable inside polite illusions. Something in them is built to detect what is not being said. They can feel the tension under the conversation, the motive under the gesture, the weakness in the arrangement that everyone else is calling solid. They are often suspicious of surfaces, and usually for good reason. Life teaches them early that appearances can lie, and that real power often lives behind the curtain, not in the official story. That can make this placement intense to live with. Scorpio already wants depth. Uranus makes that depth volatile. So there can be a restless relationship with closeness, trust, and emotional exposure. A person may crave honesty, but recoil from vulnerability. They may want total truth, yet struggle when truth changes everything. They may be drawn to experiences that feel charged, risky, or psychologically revealing, simply because ordinary life can feel too thin. There is a reason for that. Uranus in Scorpio belongs to generations that are often forced to confront subjects other people prefer to sanitize: power, sex, betrayal, trauma, death, taboo, shared resources, hidden systems of control. This placement tends to strip innocence from collective conversations. It pushes difficult material into view, not to be dramatic for the sake of it, but because pretending does not work forever. And Scorpio knows that. It knows what festers. It knows what leaks through the cracks. It knows that whatever gets buried alive does not stay quiet. That is why Uranus in Scorpio can produce people with remarkable psychological insight. They are often less shocked than others by the darker side of life because they can sense it without needing it spelled out. They may have a gift for research, investigation, therapy, strategy, healing work, crisis management, or any field that requires nerve and emotional honesty. They can go where other people freeze. But there is a shadow to that strength. A person with this influence can become overly guarded, hypervigilant, or addicted to emotional extremes. They may test people, withhold, probe, or hold too tightly because losing control feels intolerable. Sometimes they keep waiting for the hidden betrayal, even when none is there. Sometimes they provoke intensity just to feel something real. Sometimes they confuse transformation with destruction and burn down what could have been repaired. That is one of the harder lessons here. Not every ending is liberation. Not every crisis is growth. Not every secret is wisdom. Not every powerful feeling deserves to run the whole show. Uranus in Scorpio has to learn how to tell the difference between depth and drama, between truth and compulsion, between instinct and suspicion. That takes maturity because this is not light energy. It is fierce, private, and often operating several layers below what is visible on the outside. Still, when it grows into itself, this placement is extraordinary. It brings courage in places where courage really counts. Not performative courage. Not the loud kind. The kind that can sit with what is uncomfortable, name what is real, and keep going without flinching. These are often the people who help break generational silence, expose corrupt dynamics, or understand that healing is not pretty work. It is honest work. It asks for nerve. It asks for willingness. It asks for the ability to let an old self die when that old self can no longer carry the truth. There's also something magnetically intelligent about Uranus in Scorpio. It can see leverage. It can see motive. It can sense where the actual point of transformation is, even when everyone else is distracted by appearances. That can make this generation powerful reformers in areas involving sexuality, psychology, finance, medicine, trauma, secrecy, and systems built around unequal power. They do not simply want change. They want the real thing, the root level thing, the irreversible thing. And that is why this placement can unsettle people. It does not always arrive with softness. Sometimes it arrives like a confrontation no one wanted but everyone needed. Sometimes it exposes the rot. Sometimes it forces the truth. Sometimes it breaks the spell. That is Uranus in Scorpio. A generation that does not leave hidden material untouched. a generation that understands that intimacy without truth is a performance, a generation that learns, often the hard way, that control is not the same thing as strength. And at its highest expression, it becomes a force for deep renewal, not surface reinvention, not cosmetic change, the kind that happens when something false finally collapses, and what remains has more honesty, more depth, and far more power than the old structure ever did. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more astrology content. Uranus in Sagittarius. Uranus in Sagittarius is what happens when freedom gets philosophical. This is not rebellion for the sake of noise. It wants range, air, space to move, space to think, space to test life against experience instead of swallowing whatever answer was handed down first. When Uranus moves through Sagittarius, the pressure builds around belief, truth, travel, education, religion, culture, and the stories people use to make sense of the world. And once that pressure builds, old certainties start cracking. Sagittarius is the sign that wants meaning. It wants perspective. It wants the bigger picture. It wants to know what is out there beyond the local script, beyond the small-minded rulebook, beyond the version of reality that says this is all there is, and this is how it must be. Uranus steps into that territory and stirs the whole thing up. Suddenly, the familiar worldview feels too narrow. The old doctrine feels stale. The approved answer stops satisfying. So this placement tends to belong to generations that challenge inherited belief systems in a big way. Sometimes that shows up through religion, sometimes through academia, sometimes through law, politics, publishing, global culture, or the simple fact that people are no longer willing to stay mentally boxed in. There is usually a restless intelligence here, but it does not operate like Gemini. Gemini gathers facts. Sagittarius asks what those facts mean. Sagittarius wants direction, not just information. It wants an idea large enough to live by. Uranus makes that search more experimental, more rebellious, and harder to contain. People with this energy often feel allergic to intellectual confinement. They do not do well with environments that punish curiosity, demand blind agreement, or treat one worldview as sacred and final. Even when they are raised inside a very fixed system, something in them keeps pushing against the walls. They want to see for themselves. They want to test the horizon. They want to know what else is true once fear is no longer running the conversation. That can make them exciting. It can also make them impossible to pin down. Uranus in Sagittarius often brings a person who changes through movement. Travel changes them. Exposure changes them. Ideas from outside their background change them. Sometimes one conversation, one book, one teacher, one sudden encounter with a wider world can reroute everything. They may outgrow old beliefs quickly, and once they do, it is hard to get them to pretend otherwise. At its best, this placement brings bold thinkers, cultural bridge builders, provocative teachers, explorers, truth seekers, and people who know how to shake others out of mental sleep. There is real enthusiasm here when it is healthy. Not forced positivity, but genuine appetite for life. A sense that there is more to discover, more to understand, more to question, more to become. That appetite can be contagious. The trouble starts when the hunger for freedom turns self-righteous or careless. Sagittarius can get convinced it has found the truth. Uranus can get attached to being the one who breaks the mold. Put those together, and you can get arrogance disguised as enlightenment. A person may reject one dogma only to turn their new belief into another one. They may become preachy, reckless, dismissive, or so committed to independence that they stop listening altogether. There can also be a tendency to outrun depth. This placement loves possibility, but not every possibility deserves devotion. Not every open road leads somewhere worth going. Not every bold idea is wisdom. Sometimes the person becomes so enchanted by the next revelation that they never stay still long enough to digest what they have already learned. That is part of the work here. Uranus in Sagittarius has to learn that freedom without reflection becomes drift. Conviction without humility becomes propaganda. Adventure without purpose becomes avoidance. Once that clicks, the placement gets much stronger. Then you get people who can expand a room just by walking into it. People who bring wider perspective without sounding superior. People who challenge cultural assumptions, not because they enjoy provoking people for sport, but because they can feel when a belief system has gone dead and is still pretending to be alive. There is often a big, bright quality to this sign placement. Even when the person is serious, there is something in them that resists spiritual suffocation. They want life to mean something. They want thought to stay open. They want room for wonder, but not at the expense of honesty. When they are grounded, they can inspire real growth in others because they remind people that the world is larger than fear, larger than dogma, larger than whatever tiny map they were told was the whole territory. Uranus in Sagittarius does not want a truth that sits politely on a shelf. It wants a truth you can travel with, a truth that survives contact with real life, a truth that keeps opening instead of closing. That is the higher expression of this placement. Not rebellion as identity, not belief as performance, not freedom as an excuse to avoid commitment. Something better than that. A living philosophy, a wider horizon, a mind and spirit that refuse to stay trapped in small rooms once the door has been found. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more astrology content. Uranus in Capricorn. Uranus in Capricorn brings disruption to the structure itself. This is the placement that questions the rules, the hierarchy, the institution, the ladder everybody was told to climb without asking who built it or whether it still works. Capricorn deals with authority, responsibility, ambition, public life, and the systems that shape success. Uranus steps into that territory and starts applying pressure exactly where things have become too rigid, too hollow, or too outdated to keep pretending. So this generation often has a complicated relationship with power. They can respect competence. They can admire discipline. They can work hard, think long-term, and take life seriously. But they do not automatically trust titles, status, or tradition just because those things come dressed as legitimacy. They tend to notice when leadership has become performative, when institutions protect themselves more than the people inside them, and when stability is really just stagnation with good branding. That is where the tension begins. Because Capricorn does not naturally want chaos. It wants order. It wants something that lasts. It wants a structure that can hold weight. Uranus is not interested in preserving the outer shell if the inside is already failing. So this placement often produces people who are here to modernize systems from within, challenge them from the outside, or build new ones altogether. Not rebellion for drama, rebellion with a blueprint. That is what makes this sign combination so interesting. It is not usually wild in an obvious way. It is strategic, measured, sometimes even restrained on the surface. But underneath, there is a refusal to keep investing in systems that demand loyalty without integrity. These are often the people who sense early that the old model is wearing thin. The career path that promised security starts looking draining. The institution that was supposed to be respectable starts looking compromised. The authority figure who seemed solid turns out to be all image and no backbone. And once that illusion breaks, it changes everything. Uranus in Capricorn can bring major generational shifts around business, government, work culture, leadership, technology, and the very definition of achievement. It pushes people to ask harder questions. What is success if it costs too much? What is discipline if it kills aliveness? What is tradition worth if it only protects dead weight? This placement often belongs to people who are trying to find a different relationship with pressure. Capricorn knows how to endure. It knows how to keep going, keep producing, keep carrying responsibility even when the personal cost is high. Uranus disrupts that pattern. It can bring sudden changes in direction, public role, career goals, or the person's whole idea of what they are building toward. That can be unsettling, especially for Capricorn energy, which likes control and tends to trust what has been tested. But that is part of the lesson here. Strength is not the same thing as hardness. Endurance is not the same thing as wisdom. And a structure is not automatically good just because it has been standing for a long time. At its best, Uranus in Capricorn creates reformers who actually know how systems work. Builders who can spot a flaw in the design before the collapse becomes obvious. Leaders who are not hypnotized by prestige. There is often real talent here for strategy, planning, management, entrepreneurship, engineering, policy, organization, and any field where change has to be made practical to matter. This energy can be incredibly effective when it matures. It knows how to update without becoming sloppy. It knows how to challenge authority without becoming directionless. It knows how to take the future seriously. Of course, there is a shadow side. A person with this placement can become split between ambition and resistance. One part wants to succeed. Another part distrusts the whole game. They may overwork themselves trying to earn approval from systems they no longer believe in. Or they may reject structure so completely that they end up drifting, even though they are capable of building something much better. There can also be emotional shutdown here. Capricorn already knows how to compartmentalize. Uranus can make that more extreme. The person may hide instability behind competence, or use productivity to avoid facing how dissatisfied they really are. That is why the deeper growth is so important. Uranus in Capricorn asks for a more honest kind of strength, not control for its own sake, not achievement that empties a person out, not respectability built on fear. Something cleaner than that. A life with structure, but not suffocation. A calling with weight, but not deadness. A future built with intention, not blind obedience. That is Uranus in Capricorn. A generation that questions authority at the foundation. A generation that sees where the system has gone brittle. A generation that understands that sometimes the responsible move is not to preserve the old framework, but to redesign it before it fails everybody relying on it. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more astrology content. Uranus in Aquarius. Uranus in Aquarius has a native feel for the future. This is one of those placements that does not easily settle into the world exactly as it is. Even when the person learns how to function inside existing systems, some part of them is still scanning for what comes next, what no longer makes sense, what needs updating, and what kind of collective life might work better than the one people keep defending out of habit. Aquarius is already concerned with the wider pattern. It looks at groups, networks, ideas, systems, social change, and the strange gap between how people live now and how they could live if they were less afraid, less rigid, less attached to obsolete structures. Uranus intensifies that instinct. It brings electricity to thought, disruption to the status quo, and a strong need to detach from whatever has become stale, performative, or mentally closed. So this placement often belongs to people who are hard to fully domesticate, not necessarily rebellious in a loud or theatrical way. Sometimes it is subtler than that. They may seem calm, intelligent, even self-contained, but underneath there is usually a very independent current. They do not like being told what everybody else thinks, what normal people do, what respectable opinion looks like, or which ideas are supposedly off limits. The minute thought starts getting policed, this placement starts pushing back. That can make them refreshing. It can also make them difficult, because Uranus in Aquarius does not automatically respect convention, especially social convention. If a rule feels pointless, they want to know why it exists. If a tradition seems exclusionary, they are likely to challenge it. If a group starts acting like consensus is the same thing as truth, they can become deeply skeptical. There's usually a strong instinct here to think independently, but always in relation to the larger whole. This is not just about personal freedom. It is about how society organizes itself, who gets included, who gets left out, and what kind of future is quietly being built through today's assumptions. That is where the placement gets really interesting. Because Aquarius is not just about innovation. It is also about ideals. And ideals can become rigid just as easily as traditions can. A person with Uranus in Aquarius may see very clearly what is wrong with the old system, but still has to learn that not every new idea is automatically wise, humane, or workable. Sometimes this energy gets so attached to progress that it forgets human beings do not live as concepts. They live in bodies, relationships, contradictions, and emotional realities that cannot always be solved by a theory. That is one of the core tensions here. The mind can run ahead. The vision can run ahead. The person can become so devoted to possibility that they lose patience with the slower, messier side of actual life. At its best, though, this is a remarkable placement for collective intelligence. It can produce original thinkers, inventors, reformers, organizers, social visionaries, and people who understand how culture shifts long before the shift becomes obvious. They often have a natural feel for patterns in the group field. They can sense when an old model is on borrowed time. They can also spot where people are still trapped in outdated categories and calling it common sense. There is often real courage here, though it is not always emotional courage in the usual sense. It is the courage to stand apart mentally, to hold a different perspective without needing immediate approval, to question groupthink even when groupthink is fashionable. That matters because Aquarius can be associated with communities, but Uranus here often teaches that belonging means very little if it requires intellectual conformity. This placement can also coincide with generations shaped by major shifts in technology, social structures, communication networks, activism, and the broader idea of what community even is. Suddenly people connect differently, organize differently, identify differently, participate differently. The old social map stops reflecting reality, and a new one starts forming in real time. That can be exhilarating. It can also create distance. One of the shadow expressions of Uranus in Aquarius is detachment that becomes excessive. The person may stay in the head to avoid the vulnerability of the heart. They may become more comfortable with systems than with intimacy, more comfortable with principles than with feelings, more comfortable analyzing people than letting people truly affect them. Sometimes they pride themselves on objectivity when what is really happening is emotional self-protection. There can also be a reflexive contrarian streak here. Not because every disagreement is meaningful, but because agreeing too easily can feel like surrendering independence. In weaker moments, the person may reject perfectly good structures simply because they are structures, or they may become so identified with being ahead of the curve that they lose touch with what is actually useful, grounded, or human. That is why maturity matters so much with this sign. Uranus in Aquarius is strongest when brilliance is paired with conscience, when originality is paired with humility, when a person can imagine something better without becoming cold, superior, or allergic to ordinary human needs. The real gift here is not just seeing the future. It is helping make that future more intelligent, more open, and more livable for other people too. And when this placement is operating well, it can do exactly that. It brings minds that are inventive without becoming gimmicky. It brings perspective without blind obedience. It brings reform energy that is not just about tearing down, but about creating new ways to connect, collaborate, and think. That is Uranus in Aquarius, a generation that does not mistake consensus for truth, a generation that questions the shape of the collective itself, a generation that keeps asking whether the world people inherited is really the world they want to keep building. And at its highest expression, it reminds us that progress is not just novelty. It is the courage to imagine a better system and the intelligence to make it real. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more astrology content. Uranus in Pisces. Uranus in Pisces changes the invisible world first. This is not the kind of placement that always shows its disruptions in obvious, concrete ways. The movement often begins underneath, in dreams, in intuition, in spiritual hunger, in emotional atmosphere, in the quiet dissolving of boundaries people once relied on to feel oriented. Pisces already lives close to what cannot be neatly explained. Uranus enters that terrain and stirs the waters. The result is a generation that often feels change before it can define it. Pisces is tied to imagination, compassion, longing, symbolism, faith, surrender, escape, and the vast emotional field people swim in without fully noticing. Uranus brings shocks, awakening, reversals, and the urge to break through whatever has become numb, stale, or falsely contained. Put them together, and the old psychic map starts losing its authority. What used to feel spiritually certain may stop making sense. What looked solid may turn out to be porous. The person starts sensing that reality is much stranger, more fluid, and less controllable than they were taught. That can be beautiful. It can also be disorienting. People shaped by this placement often have a different relationship to intuition than the generations around them. They may pick up on undercurrents quickly, absorb moods without trying, or feel drawn to music, film, mysticism, healing, art, or altered states simply because ordinary reality seems incomplete. There is often a real sensitivity here, but it does not always arrive in a soft, dreamy package. Sometimes it shows up as psychic overload, sometimes as confusion, sometimes as a deep need to unplug from harsh, mechanical environments that feel spiritually deadening. Uranus in Pisces tends to question the invisible assumptions people live inside. What are we believing without examining? What are we escaping instead of healing? What are we calling faith when it is really fantasy? And what are we calling fantasy when it is actually a neglected part of human truth? Those questions matter with Pisces because this sign can hold both inspiration and illusion. It can open the heart in extraordinary ways, but it can also blur lines that need to stay clear. Uranus does not let that remain passive. It agitates the whole field. Suddenly people are forced to look at how much of their inner life is genuine guidance and how much is wishful thinking, projection, seduction, or avoidance dressed in spiritual language. So this placement often belongs to generations that reshape the collective relationship to spirituality, creativity, healing, compassion, addiction, media fantasy, and the search for transcendence. The old stories about salvation may stop working. New forms of spiritual exploration emerge. Art becomes more experimental. Boundaries around identity, reality, and meaning become less fixed. People start reaching for something beyond the ordinary, but not always with the same methods or the same beliefs that existed before. That is where the gift and the risk live side by side. At its best, Uranus in Pisces can bring extraordinary imaginative intelligence. These are often the people who sense what is coming before it has language. They may be drawn to healing work, spiritual inquiry, artistic innovation, psychology, music, cinema, symbolic systems, or compassionate service. They can help others access states of feeling, vision, and understanding that are difficult to reach through logic alone. There is often a genuine ability here to soften what has become too hard, too cynical, or too disconnected from soul. But if this energy is not grounded, it can drift. A person may become fascinated by mystery and lose interest in discernment. They may romanticize what should be questioned. They may blur emotional and psychic boundaries so much that they no longer know what belongs to them and what they have absorbed from everyone else. In some cases, the hunger to transcend pain becomes an excuse to avoid it. That is when Pisces becomes slippery and Uranus makes the instability harder to manage. This placement does not do well with denial for long, though. Eventually something breaks the spell. The illusion stops holding. The coping mechanism stops working. The fantasy loses its glow. And the person has to build a more honest relationship with sensitivity, intuition, and escape. That is where the deeper strength appears. Because Uranus in Pisces is not here to make people less sensitive. It is here to wake sensitivity up, to sharpen it, to free it from confusion, seduction, and emotional fog. The lesson is not to shut the door on mystery. It is to enter mystery with clearer eyes, to allow wonder without surrendering judgment, to trust intuition without making it a license for chaos. When this placement matures, it can be quietly extraordinary. Then you get people who can move between worlds without getting lost in them. People who can imagine more compassionate futures without dissolving into fantasy. People who understand that softness is not weakness, and that spiritual life is not meant to be a hiding place from reality, but a deeper way of meeting it. Uranus in Pisces brings change through the unseen, through symbols, through feeling, through the collective dream, through the longing for something more alive than the ordinary script. And at its highest expression, it helps a generation open the heart, widen the imagination, and question every false division between the visible and the invisible, the rational and the intuitive, the human and the sacred. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more astrology content.